I was in the middle of editing this video when the news broke that the United States had dropped bunker buster bombs on nuclear sites in Iran. So this video isn't about that, but I wanted to acknowledge it. Hopefully this will finish the job Israel started of removing the threat of the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. On this channel, I often say history repeats itself. Is that true in this case? At first, I said no, but I'm having to rethink it. Let's see why I might have been wrong at first. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I'm writing a series of novels called Age of the Kingdom, about the period when Israel had a united monarchy under King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. 3 books are available now at GaryIvey.com. They trace several generations of a mostly fictional family against the backdrop of the period. So on this channel, I talk about the events of that period 3,000 years ago and why they are important to us today. When I saw that Israel had begun doing what I expected them to do for years, take out Iran's nuclear capability, at first I said there wasn't a history repeats itself angle. But I think my initial thought was wrong. First, let's remember that about 2,600 years ago, what we now call Iran was called Medo-Persia, and it was a great empire that conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire and stretched from Ethiopia and Europe in the west to India in the east. The reason I didn't think that there was a history repeats itself angle was that the nation of Judah, including the residents of Jerusalem, were taken into captivity by Babylon and were there for nearly 70 years before the Medo-Persians conquered the city and therefore the empire of Babylon. Some of the captives were taken from Babylon to Persia, but the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jews who wanted to leave Persia and return to Jerusalem and even rebuild the wall and the temple. This was true of multiple people groups who got swept up in the empire change. Many of them were allowed to return to their homelands. So I thought Israel's experience of the Medo-Persian Empire was positive, but I forgot one big exception, the story of Esther. And that's where the history repeats itself angle really gets legs. Ironically, I was reminded of this because in my last video, I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how an AI model has caused scholars to move the estimated date of the Daniel scroll back about 100 years to 230 BC. I wasn't concerned with it at the time, but there is a passage in Daniel 10 where Daniel is distressed about the vision he had in chapter 9, praying and mourning for 3 weeks, wanting to know the meaning of the vision. By this time, Daniel, who spent most of his life in Babylon, is now an old man living in Persia, where he is an important dignitary in the government of Darius, who followed Cyrus. Finally, an angel comes to give him the interpretation of the vision, but before he does, he actually begs Daniel's pardon for being so late. He explains that he was being opposed for 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia, but Michael, one of the leading princes, came to help me. Now, if you know anything about Christian tradition, you know that Michael is the archangel, the number 1 angel in heaven. As an aside, there's a church about 1.5 miles from me named Michael the Archangel Catholic Church. This angel that came to Daniel needed the help of the most important, most powerful angel of heaven in his conflict with the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Because it calls Michael a prince, we can safely conclude that the prince of Persia was not a human prince, but an evil angel assigned to Persia. If you're unaware, another thing made plain several places in the Bible is that there's a battle going on in the spirit realm, mirroring the battle between good and evil in the material realm. We're told that an angel named Lucifer succeeded in deceiving 1/3 of the angels of heaven to join him in rebelling against God, and that Lucifer and his angels were forcibly ejected from heaven, and they came to earth. Jesus called Lucifer, also known as the devil or Satan, the ruler of this world. What we can learn from this angel's excuse to Daniel is that there are evil angels assigned to territories, and they have enough power that the angels of God sometimes have to call for reinforcements. So that story about spiritual warfare in Persia reminded me about the book of Esther, which tells of a narrowly averted holocaust against the Jews 2,600 years ago. The modern nation of Israel was brought into being by the British and the UN after the Holocaust, which caused the death of 6 million Jews in World War II. On October 7, 2023, Hamas, a proxy of Iran, killed more Jews than any time since Hitler's Holocaust. But these events in modern times were foreshadowed by something eerily similar in ancient Persia. Esther, the young woman for whom the biblical book is named, was among the captives taken from Babylon to Persia when the empires changed. Her only living relative was Mordecai, an uncle, who took her under his wing. Anyway, Esther got caught up in a bizarre beauty contest because the Persian king Xerxes rejected his favorite wife, and he was looking for a new favorite to be queen. Long story short, Esther won the contest and became queen of Persia. No one in the Persian government realized she was a Jewish captive, and her uncle advised that she keep that quiet. But there was a character who had risen high in the Persian government who was also a foreigner with a past connected to Israel. He was Haman and was called the Agagite. That ties directly to a story that I include in Quest for a King, the first novel in my series. The prophet Samuel directed King Saul to wipe out the Amalekites, which were a desert tribe in the Negev south of Israel. The reason given was because Amalekites attacked Israel when they were making their way out of slavery in Egypt. Saul was told to completely annihilate the Amalekites, leaving neither man, woman, or child alive. In fact, he was directed by the prophet not to save even their animals. Saul failed to follow the letter of Samuel's instructions, keeping valuable flocks and herds alive and preserving an Amalekite king as a trophy. The king's name was Agag. So Agag's family must have also survived because Haman was the Agagite. Of course, we know that Saul didn't kill all the Amalekites because David had to fight them later on as well. Saul probably found as many of the migratory tribes as he could and called it a day. So now, 400 years later, a descendant of the Amalekite king Saul spared, but Samuel ultimately beheaded, turns up many miles away in Persia. So Haman's animus toward the Jews probably grew out of his heritage and Saul's near extermination of his people, but it was brought to a head because of Esther's uncle. Mordecai held a position in Xerxes' government, but he offended Haman because he didn't grovel enough, apparently. So Haman resented him. It probably didn't help that Mordecai was a Jew. Unfortunately for Haman, he knew Mordecai was a Jew, but was unaware that Queen Esther was also. So Haman somehow convinced Xerxes that it would be good to rid the country of the Jews, and he set a date when the Jews would be rounded up and slaughtered. Xerxes signed a law to that effect, not realizing that his queen was a Jew. Meantime, Haman contracted to have gallows built for Mordecai as a special punishment for his disrespect. Mordecai got word to Esther that she needed to do something, and maybe God allowed her to become queen for just this situation. There were two challenges. First, even though she was queen, no woman could just walk into the royal throne room uninvited. And even more important, Persian kings were considered gods. When they put their signature on a law, it could never be changed because gods didn't make mistakes. So Esther decided to enter the king's throne room unbidden and said the words for which she is famous, "I will go to the king. If I perish, I perish." Luckily, the king saw her enter and did not order her killed, but asked what she wanted. She diplomatically asked not for what she really wanted, but for the king and Haman to join her in a private banquet. Haman must have thought everything was coming up roses for him. He would have his revenge on the Jews, and the queen was honoring him together with the king and them alone. Again, making a long story short, Esther revealed that she was a Jew and would be subject to Haman's law, demanding the annihilation of all the Jews in the realm. The king was outraged and commanded that Haman be hung on the gallows he built for Mordecai. That did not solve the problem of the law Xerxes had signed, but Esther had a solution for that too. She suggested another law that would allow the Jews to defend themselves when anyone came to kill them. When the day came, some tried to execute the first order to kill all the Jews, but the Jews defended themselves, as was allowed by the second order, and killed some 75,000 men who came against them. The cherry on top was that Mordecai was given Haman's position, and so he was able to use the king's signet ring to certify the second order. There is more to the story, of course, but I've recounted enough to point out how history is repeating itself today. The first thing that happened was, after a period of persecution and displacement, the Jews were allowed by King Cyrus to return to their homeland and rebuild. That happened again in 1948, when the modern nation of Israel was created after the Nazi Holocaust. Then you have a man whose hatred of the Jews caused him to want to kill them all. Remind you of anyone? But the Jews were legally allowed to defend themselves. Is it an exact match? No. When history repeats itself, it doesn't ever repeat exactly, but human nature being what it is, hatred and ancient grudges will often cause movements of history to repeat. One more interesting fact. Did you know that the name of the country Iran comes from the word Aryan? The Nazis in Germany were fond of calling themselves Aryans, although they were not really, and the idea of an Aryan race has been discredited. Aryan is the name given to an ancient language that existed from northern Iran to India. Most Iranians are not Arabs like Iraqis or Saudis. They are Indo-European. It's also interesting that Iran retained diplomatic ties with Germany during World War II. So we can see parallels between the Jews and Israel defending themselves from Iran and its proxies to today, to the story of Esther, with one man's hatred of Jews and desire to annihilate them. Iran has spent decades trying to get nuclear weapons for one purpose, to obliterate Israel. They almost got there, too, just like Haman came really close to wiping out all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Time will tell if Iran's Ayatollah meets a similar fate to that of Haman. Well, that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.